Hi everyone, and welcome back to another video. I feel like it's been so long since I've sat down and filmed a video, probably because it has been. I was in a little bit of a reading slump for a while just because school and college stuff was, taking priority. But now that things have calmed down a little bit, I'm really excited to get back into reading. And I had the idea for this really fun video, which is the one that you're watching, and I thought I would go through books through the decades. So these are books that I read and it really either reminded me of a certain decade or it was published in a certain decade. And so I just thought it would be a cool idea, especially because I've seen a big trend that schools are doing a lot of times where each grade level gets a different decade to dress up like they're from. My school did it. I was the early 2000s. It was really fun. So I figured, why not translate that into the booktube community? It might be kind of fun. So this is in no way a super serious video. I'm not gonna, sit here and talk about how each book directly represents something from each decade. These are books that just sort of gave me the vibes of certain time periods. And I just thought it would be really fun to make. So here we are. The first decade that I'm starting with is the 60s. And to be completely honest, there was only one book that stood out to me that was published in the 60s and is also set in the 60s. And that was The Outsiders by S.E. Hinton. This book I've talked about before. It's one of my favorite classic books that I've ever read. I read it for the first time when I was in, I think, 5th grade.
Excuse you.
I read it for the first time in 5th grade, and then I read it again in 7th grade with my school class and loved it. It's a coming of age story. One of my favorite aspects of this book is that it is written by a woman, and at the time, female authors and the sort of YA genre were kind of non-existent and were not popular at all. And so this is sort of the first coming of age novel written by a woman that really sort of sprang to life and sort of became really popular. And it really is just a great story. I think it's held up relatively well over the years, just a few things here and there, but overall I think it's still a fabulous book, and it's one that, at least in the United States, kids tend to read in middle school, especially my friends who aren't readers and usually just don't read books that they're assigned in school. Almost all of them read this one just because it was that good and interesting, and the movie's great too. So this is my book pick for the 60s, and check it out if you get the chance. Second decade is the 70s, and I love the 70s in terms of fashion and music and just things like that. And so today the book that represents that genre is probably not a surprise to anybody watching this video, but it is Daisy Jones and the Six. So this book is a book about a band that spans from the early 70s all the way into the early 80s, and it sort of follows this band and the lead singer Daisy on their journey from being a band to a solo act and all the sorts of love and drugs and things that went on behind the scenes of this band. And it's sort of written in an interview format. The audiobook's really great too. It has a full cast of characters. It really sounds like you're listening to an interview happening. It's soon to become a TV series adaptation. It actually has already been filmed, everything like that. I'm just waiting for it to come out. I'm so excited about it. But yeah, this was a great book to read if you're feeling like you want a good fame kind of centered drama, I guess, and it is set in the 70s, which is super fun. So definitely check this one out if that sounds like it would be interesting for you. And now we get to my favorite decade that I wish I was born in, which is the 80s. The reason I say this is because I have very curly hair, and back in the 80s, the fashion centered around big hair, and I just feel like I would have fit right in. The book that I actually chose for the 80s, I had a few options, but the one that I ended up going with is My Best Friend's Exorcism by Grady Hendrix. Now, this is a book set in the 80s. It is a horror novel / thriller about this girl whose best friend gets sort of taken over by a demon, and she has to perform an exorcism. That's the general idea of the book, and overall it was just a really fun time. I read it around Halloween time 2 years ago. This book it actually was not published in the 80s. It was published in, I believe, the 2010s. And of course, my parents grew up in the 80s, so, I've been influenced a lot by 80s media, like Back to the Future and a bunch of these classic films, like Ferris Bueller's Day Off, things like that I just really enjoyed. So this one was super fun to read. It really made me feel like I was in the 80s and performing an exorcism, which might not be as fun for some of you, but it seemed like a good time to me. The next book on this list for the 90s is The Secret History by Donna Tartt. Surprise, surprise. Who is surprised? The answer is no one. This book, again, is one of my favorite books of all time. If you've watched this channel, you know that. This book was published in 1992, and it is very much like the staple of the dark academia genre, and has a lot of those tropes in it. Basically, it's about this elite society at this very prestigious university in Colorado, and it's about this guy who gets sort of enveloped in this sort of cultish sort of group of people who are all Greek students. It was unlike anything I'd ever read before, and it very much was sort of like on the verge of thriller, and it was just so exciting. And I picked it for the 90s genre just because I feel like this was one of those books that if you were a reader in the 90s, you probably read this book, just because it was like the staple of fiction. At least that's what I've gathered. But yeah, I think all the characters were super well developed. Donna Tartt is a great author, and it's written really well, and it's not too difficult to read either. So if you are interested in sort of like a dark academia thriller, there you go. The next book that I'm going to be talking about is a staple of the 2000s decade. The book technically came out in 1999, but it definitely, I think, influenced a lot of young teenagers in the early 2000s, and that book is The Perks of Being a Wallflower. This was a book that I read going into my freshman year of high school. It is sort of written in a letter format. We definitely have a little bit of an unreliable narrator, just because it's hard to know what's a figment of his thoughts and his feelings rather than what's actually happening and what's actually happened. And there's a lot that is left out in his letters. But basically all we know going into this, it's about our main character writing letters to someone, we don't know who, and he's sort of just talking about his life and the things that he's experienced and the things that he is sort of prepping himself to experience as he moves into high school. And so it follows him through that journey, along with some characters who also impact his feelings and his experiences as well. So this one is great. I think that it definitely was another one of those staples of young adult fiction, especially in the early 2000s. It has since then become a movie. It's a pretty decent movie. Check it out. It has Emma Watson in it, who played Hermione Granger in the Harry Potter series. So yeah, go ahead, check it out. The final book that I will be talking about on this list is within the decade of the 2010s, and if you also have watched this channel, you know this book. This is probably my favorite book of all time, and that is The Fault in Our Stars by John Green. Again, people will make fun of me. They will say that this is a basic book to be your favorite book of all time, but it was one of those books that just sort of really gave me just a new perspective on life. And that being that life is short and you have to make the most of every moment. And two, I read this when I was like in 6th grade, and it was like the first romance book, not really romance, but like sort of, it's a romance book, let's be honest. It was sort of like the first book of that genre that I'd ever read, and so it definitely impacted me. It had a huge impact on me. And also, again, I'm going to use this word again, but it was a staple of the young adults in the 2010s, which was me. Especially, I think I read this around like 2015, 2016. The movie had come out a few years prior, and so this one was definitely still one of those books being recommended by English teachers to their students, being like, hey, you'd love this book. Hey, you love to read, check out this book. So I think definitely that this is one that represents the early 2000s so well. So those were my picks of books throughout the decades. Again, I probably could have done some more research and picked books that were like a little bit more in tune of like what was going on during those decades, but I just wanted to make a fun video. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. I know it wasn't super well planned or anything, but if you'd like to see more of these, if you think I should do more books from decades, I don't know, let me know. And thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.